Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll wait a couple more minutes for everyone to join, and then we'll begin. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on unlocking the full potential of your compliance data. My name is Kayla Wilson, and I'm a regional sales manager here at Anecdotes. I'm very excited to be joined by Omer Singer, head of cybersecurity strategy at Snowflake, Brian Lee, senior global compliance operations manager at Snowflake, and Marie Amur, co-founder and chief product officer at Anecdotes. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Hi. Before I invite you to introduce yourselves and we kick off our discussion, I want to remind our audience that at the end of our conversation, there will be time for Q&A. So please feel free to send us your questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. All right, great. With that out of the way, Omer, can I ask you to share a bit about your background with our audience?
Yeah, hi, Kayla. So I'm Omer Singer. I lead cybersecurity strategy at Snowflake. And I joined Snowflake about 5 years ago, initially to lead security engineering. And that's where I first started working with our GRC team. And it was really interesting to see just how much opportunity there was for automation and bringing compliance and the world of data together. So really fired up about this topic and glad to talk about it with you today.
Perfect. Thank you. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, so similar to Omer, I have been at Snowflake now for 5 years. I lead the global compliance operations that covers our Snowflake product along with our organizational compliance and risks across the globe. Yeah, so I'm really excited to kind of talk about all of the how we're going to be able to use compliance data for the purposes of.
Great. And lastly, our very own Roy, can you share a little bit about yourself with our audience?
Yeah, thank you, Kayla. Nice to meet you all. I've co-founded Anecdotes 3 years ago with a mission to make compliance a more data-driven domain, more data-driven market. And thankfully, we are partnering here with a data leader like Snowflake. This is part of our philosophy. So really happy to be here. At Anecdotes, I act as the chief product officer, running the product department and customers department. Very interesting topic today.
Absolutely. All right. We definitely have great people here with us. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Our topic today is unlocking the full potential of your compliance data. Compliance teams collect and validate large amounts of data to meet their compliance objectives, whether preparing for audits or managing ongoing compliance programs. As we all know, data is a valuable asset to the organization, and compliance data is no different. So today we're going to touch on the ways that this data can be leveraged and how it can drive value to the organization. Before we dive in, let's take a minute just to cover the basics. So Roy, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off, how would you define security compliance data and what are some examples?
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes or the obvious places where people go when talking about compliance data is to think of their audit and what artifacts they should provide as part of this audit. Now, actually to be compliant means to cover a lot of aspects in your organization from different aspects, from HR aspects, development, SDLC, security, and every piece of data that comes from these areas in the company actually supports your understanding if you are really compliant with what you have defined in your policies, in your methodologies. Now, when we have started thinking of anecdotes where the world was still counting on screenshots and things that are not data to support compliance, we took the mission to standardize things. So we started to think and map different attributes that will serve compliance teams. And we've reached out to an interesting pattern or framework that contains several types of data artifacts. So it's around configurations, logs, lists, and workflows. And last of all are documents, obviously. So just running very quickly, configurations might be, cloud configurations, any configuration that basically says what's permitted or not, can be in your code review and merge processes, can be in your MFA, whatever. Lists are many, right? Lists of vendors, lists of users, lists of devices, plenty of data pieces from this kind. Logs are also very important, like logs of your alerts, your support tickets, your any kind of logging requirements that you have in order to facilitate actual tracking your compliance. And workflows is a very interesting part because many processes that used to be managed as a document of procedure, very heavy, right? Very non-functional, but just defined as a document, is nowadays implemented in a SaaS tool as a process, as a workflow. So let's take employee onboarding, right? Everyone has their employee onboarding as a workflow defined in their HR tool. So that's also a compliance artifact, and it's a data used for compliance. And list is also, of course, documents. Policies are here to stay, at least for now. So they also compose a part of what is compliance data.
Awesome. Can you elaborate on why security compliance data is important for organizations?
Yeah, I think that as long as people didn't follow or created the data and relied on it to their understanding their compliance posture, companies were basically blind, right? You would define some policy, you would tell yourself that you are tracking it, and once a year, once a quarter, when an external audit came or whatever, you would check for now where my status is with non-updating pieces of evidence. Or let's take another angle. I said that it's not just around audits, right? Let's take risk management. So you have risks. Every risk has mitigating controls. Now, these controls must be backed with real data that says, yeah, this control is actually being implemented and functional. And as long as you didn't support it with data, you're pretty much blind. And I was talking to dozens of risk owners around companies, and they don't necessarily have any visibility to what actually happens with things that they have defined as mitigating controls. So data is the fuel for the integrity of the entire GRC process, right? It's the place where you should really understand that you can count on what you've built. So that's the importance for me, integrity and understanding that you deal with real things out there.
And you mentioned visibility. It reminds me of a conversation that Brian and I had a few years ago when we were kind of just starting off our compliance, our data-driven compliance journey. And at the time, I think we took an approach that many organizations still take, where there wasn't that complete visibility that you described. And there was an audit, and the auditors had a finding. They happened to find some system that wasn't running, some agent, and they dinged us for it on the audit. And I talked to Brian afterwards. I'm like, Brian, how could this happen? And Brian said, look, like we didn't have the data for this, and they found it, and I think that helped us shift our perspective. We got to have the data. We got to have complete visibility so that we're never surprised in an audit, because they might go in and check the systems once a quarter. we'd be checking every day and comparing the data that describes our entire environment against our expectations of the environment. And as long as we're doing that, and as long as we have the data, then we have the visibility, we can ask these questions, and really we should never be dinged in an audit like that ever again, right? And I think that's really been the journey that we've gone down, right, Brian?
Yep, precisely. Yeah, I mean, I like to think of compliance data as like audit evidence on steroids. It's really, you're able to get all this information and put it in one spot and be able to slice and dice it as necessary. And to Omer and Rory's your point, like the visibility is such a key aspect to be able to, make sense of what your compliance posture looks like, all on a continuous basis. So.
Perfect. Thank you so much for jumping in there. Clearly, data is at the core of compliance operations, and the data sources in each organization are constantly growing. I assume that the collection and validation of evidence from various sources can be challenging. What are some of the most common obstacles that you've seen respectively, and how can organizations address those?
Yeah, I can address that. This is quite natural, right? When we say compliance data, we mean very sensitive data, usually from HR systems, your code repositories, your cloud security configurations, many aspects of sensitive data. And while doing so, you're getting a risk, right, of getting this all data together, but there's a huge opportunity in doing so. So like everything, there is a risk management, right? What can I earn from it, from putting all my risks or all my compliance data together? And then what can I do with that? I guess our conversation will also dive into that, but you must mitigate that. And while doing so, I would recommend thinking of several things. First of all, what are the permissions that you grant to any collection tool to deal with this data? So how can you trust that always it's list privilege and that only relevant pieces of information are being collected? I'll give some examples that I can think of, like from talking to customers. Access to HR tools, very sensitive. But what do you need for your compliance operation? Let's be precise here, right? You need to know the list of employees, new and living. You need to know the onboarding procedures and maybe training report, as an example. I definitely don't need to have salary information or any personal documentation or any kind of very sensitive information that is out there. And that's why I think there is a huge importance of squeezing the data that you let any tool to collect and to host for you. For that purpose, you need to be very precise with what do I really need. And apparently not everyone is really understanding this part, because there is no clear standard out there, right? We saw it as one of our missions in the very beginning, to connect between the tools out there. IDP, what do you need from an IDP? Regardless if it's like Azure AD or Okta, whatever it is, what actually artifacts you need from your IDP, and so on and so forth. So being very accurate there. That's one point. Second point is, where do you host this data? And can you really keep controlling this data while you build your own data lake inside? And this combination of being list privilege and list, I would say even take only the minimal necessary data and hosting it in a way where you can control it. This is maybe the key to enable this important, very important data lake of compliance data.
Great. And Brian,
and I actually, I'd love to hear from Brian. Thanks, Kelly. Because I was just talking to a compliance leader yesterday that's just starting on this journey, and she was like, "Well, how long is it going to take? Right? How hard is it going to be? Like, speaking of obstacles, if you're just starting out and you don't have all this data, how hard is it to get started?" What do you say, Brian?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to point to. One of the biggest challenges, because I've talked to many customers of Snowflake and compliance organizations alike, and really the hardest part is getting that data in. If they don't have a team that's set on bringing the data into a data lake or getting access to that data, it's very hard. it's one of the biggest challenges because most compliance teams just don't know how, they don't have necessarily the technical skills to go and, run a Python script to go and ingest that data in. So, yeah,
Or
that's definitely one.
skills or permissions, right?
Yes,
Many of them
that
are
too,
blocked
yes.
by
Mhm.
permission. I've seen it also.
So the topic of today's webinar is unlocking the full potential of compliance data. Omer, I'll pass this one over to you. Apart from meeting regulatory compliance requirements, what other potential value can organizations derive from security compliance data?
So I think the opportunity where you think about GRC as maybe part of the larger security organization and playing an important role in the security mission of the enterprise, I think there's this opportunity to build up more complete source of truth about everything that's happening in the organization. And sometimes you have teams on the detection and response side that play a role in that, right? And they might be really focused on the activity, but the compliance team might be really interested. For example, Roy mentioned the HR data, and that's an important data set. The configurations, who has permissions to what, classification of data might play a role in a compliance program. And if all of that data is centralized, not siloed in individual tools, but centralized in a security data lake, then absolutely there's an opportunity for this data to play a wider role. And you can imagine a situation where there's an incident response and we're trying to figure out, okay, how did something bad happen? Well, it's really important to know who had access to what, right? And if somebody was terminated and they still had access and maybe they abused that access, well, hey, that's compliance data, but it's also super relevant for that investigation and closing out that breach response. So the idea of having one complete source of truth and serving multiple different functions within the security program, I think is a huge opportunity that we have today.
Perfect. Brian, I'd love to hear your take on that as well.
Yeah, I doubled down on the being able to analyze any issues that come about and go one step further and say, not only does it help you identify and be able to effectively remediate those issues, but it's really you can do it very, very quickly. Like, so an example is like someone did something or someone got provisioned access that shouldn't have had access provisioned. Like, you can go to the data, you can know exactly who that was. You can know the last time they logged in. You can have other data like their manager's data. So you can correlate all this information to understand like the root cause of what happened and be able to really hone in on that. And then second, you're able to prioritize your resources. So when you have all the data in there and you know where your compliance posture stands from a data perspective, you can now prioritize where you want to put your resources, because some areas are going to be larger risk than others. Sometimes you can't tackle everything. When Snowflake, we're growing very fast, and it's hard to go in and say, let's fix the whole world, because there's a big world to fix. So really, it helps us use that data to be able to prioritize our resources and to address those risks based on.
And I want to add one more idea also around the opportunity here of using this data for other areas outside of just kind of the immediate compliance function, and that's around helping leadership create accountability for the wider organization, right? Because in cybersecurity, it's like, if you don't get hacked, is it because you did such a great job, or maybe you just didn't get targeted, right? It's hard to know exactly why, what didn't happen, why it didn't happen. And if you take the compliance insights and you use them not just to support a quarterly audit, but you make them available to leadership on a continuous basis, you have an opportunity to see where's progress being made, where is our posture getting better, and where is it not. And I think leadership is really looking to have that kind of visibility and then translate that into accountability that really drives the security program forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. Roy, given all of that, on a practical level, how can security compliance data be operationalized and made actionable within the organization? I think Omer kind of just touched on that, but I'd love to hear your take as well.
Yeah, so many use cases. This is just the beginning, I think, of an era where compliance managers have finally access to everything, potentially, right? When using the right tools. And it opens even, I love looking at it as the independence of them. So they were not independent by now, right? They needed to ask for permissions, for favors, sometimes from people that were not accountable to this area, to Omer's point. And then if you're reliant on the DevOps or the HR or security, AppSec, whatever, to get this data, you cannot actually be operational. Now, I got this use case, for example, from a customer saying, I wanted to do some changes in our policy of how to authentication, access control, etc. And she said, I had no access to understand to which applications we use Okta as an SSO and to which ones we use another tool for it. And finally, I have it. Now, it's not an evidence as itself, right? It's just a piece of data that means a lot to the compliance manager, because compliance managers can take it and say, okay, this is part of the story that I'm presenting to the auditor to explain how sign-on processes are working in the organization. From the other hand, it gives me an internal tool to understand how things are happening and where we are going out of policy, out of compliance, basically. So utilizing this data to investigate internally and then also to attach different pieces of data, and that's the interesting part, right? The integration between those, and actually tell a story of how the organization work, which is nowadays with, hyper-growing company, it involves plenty of sources of data. It's not anymore a single platform. So these Lego bricks tell a wider story. That's what I feel.
Perfect. Omer, data analytics is at the very core of the Snowflake cybersecurity workload. Could you share an overview of Snowflake's philosophy on that cybersecurity workload and how it relates to leveraging security compliance data?
Yeah, definitely. So Snowflake has one product, and that's the data cloud, but we have workloads that we strive to support really well because we think it's important to our customers, and it's a key to their success in a world where being data driven is so important to being successful. And traditionally, the security organization and the GRC team has operated very separately from how the rest of the enterprise handles data. So you have sales and marketing and finance, and they're all working on the kind of core enterprise data platform on one side, and then separately off in the corner, you have the security team and the compliance team, and with their own stack, very siloed tooling, and they didn't have a common language, and they didn't have a common platform. And I think that really has been holding back security and security compliance in a world where we're reading in the news all the time, a lot of innovation happening around data. Right now, we're getting into the age of AI, right? Things are just speeding up. So it's really important to bring the security and compliance organizations into the fold, to join the rest of the company on this kind of central data stack. And that's what we're all about. And when that happens, now you have the opportunity for the central data team to support the security and compliance teams around how do you collect data? How do you normalize it? How do you make sense of it? How do you report insights in a democratized self-service way to the different stakeholders that need to get them, right? All these things are unlocked when the security and compliance teams can join the rest of the company on the central data platform. And for Snowflake customers, that's Snowflake, and we're seeing it happen. We're seeing it happen. So definitely the compliance use case is one of the leading areas of the cybersecurity workload here at Snowflake.
Brian, I'd love to hear your take on elaborating on some of the use cases where security compliance data can have the most impact.
Yes. So it actually goes back to a few years ago. The first use case that we used was in regards to gathering user listings from relevant in-scope systems, and we joined that data with our HR system. So we got the employee listings, we got their manager, we got their department and cost centers, and we were able to then join that data together to perform user access reviews. And so we were able to, automatically join the data and say, okay, this person is the manager to all these employees. Here's their access, their permissions, and let's go and deliver that to automatically through using Snowflake to each of the managers to perform the user access reviews. So that's probably the biggest area that we've when we talk about, where you mentioned it is that HR data and only getting that specific stuff that we need, that can unlock so many different aspects of compliance. You talk about even policies out there and how getting those policies approved, creating workflows, automatic workflows using compliance data. There's just so many different use cases when you start taking the information you receive from these HR systems.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, the user access review is a great example, because just think of how many people in the organization are really stakeholders in this process. So you have the actual process of user access review, managers, everyone that needs to be to actually approve. If there's a problem, they open a ticket, right? Someone needs to fix that. So IT is usually also involved with that. But on the other hand, each framework, like most of the frameworks today, require that they have like a control that says user access reviews should happen this way. So ISO, PCI, SOC 2, no matter which one. And you have control owners for these controls in these frameworks, and they need to reflect it to external auditors. But then you also have risk owners that own risks that are talking about unauthorized access, et cetera, et cetera. And these risks are mitigated by the very same controls that talk about user access review. Now, risk owners are usually like managers or C-level, VP level that own the risk in the company. They have no clue of what actually happens in the data below, but if they can consume it in an automated way, that's a major thing for them. And control owners are not necessarily involved in actual tracking the process of, did this team leader approve everyone that has access in their team or not? So just from this small use case, we can see dozens of people that are involved or affected by the way that if you have a single source of truth of data coming from an integration to a certain platform, and you have the HR tool data, and it's correlated, there are no fakes inside, right? There are no differences between data that risk department consumes or the compliance GRC team consumes. And this unification of data sources and clarity of where the actual single source of truth lays, I think that's a major evolution in the way that we look at GRC operations.
Yeah, I think it's so important that everyone's speaking the same language. So I'm glad you touched on that, Roy. There's no doubt that data is changing how compliance teams work. Brian, in what ways can the utilization of compliance data enable compliance leaders to gain a more prominent role within their organization?
That's a really good question. And this is where the shift of mentality of compliance and being the second line defense when it comes to a business. And I honestly look at compliance data and what we can do here is there's three things I think about. There's visibility into your security and compliance posture. There's the ability to rapidly scale operations. And then the last real benefit that you can convey is to reduce the overall bottom line of your budget. So, I look at, so compliance right now is all the systems that are now being utilized by all these different organizations, that's just growing. So the scope of compliance is growing as a whole. And by enabling compliance data, you now are getting visibility to your program, even though the scope of everything is growing rapidly. You're still getting that same level of visibility across the board. And that's really important for leaders to be able to convey to the rest of the business, hey, we know what's going on in all of our systems. We can on a daily basis, we can see where we stand. and where we need to focus our efforts and energy. Yeah, and all this was done previously manually. So, someone would manually go and grab evidence to support, oh yeah, we performed an audit, a year and a half ago, a year ago on this particular area. But we don't know where it stands now. We'd have to put all these resources to go and understand where we stand at any given point in time if you've done it manually.
So what do you do with all that free time?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to it, I think a lot of it's like, we've been really focusing on fine tuning how we look at our compliance controls. So when we're gathering all the compliance data, we're actually going in and really saying like, what is really what matters? There's some things that are like, okay, there's little things that may just pop up that may not be as beneficial to go and address. But then there's large, big boulders that are like, these are systematic problems that we're identifying because we have access to all these different data points that now gives us kind of correlation that we need to fix this problem from the ground up. So that's kind of one of the aspects that we are now able to convey to leaders, which leaders love to see, you being able to pinpoint where that we need to put our efforts to optimize the business.
Yeah, I can share, like, just to your example, Brian, how do I see customers using it? There is the must-haves, right? If you have a PLC audit, you must work on that and be prepared on time. And then you would go to the next audit or to the next thing that is missing or gap. But when this time of just routine evidence collection, whatever, is freed, now we see a motion of very mature organizations that are going towards creating a common control frame. That's another example of how you can start talking a brighter language for management or even cross-organization. Where are the areas that lack attention or can be optimized, regardless to your different frameworks or specific controls? But as an organization, what's my policy now? Okay, fine, I support the sales with all the relevant certifications and everything outside. But now as a company, I can grow. So focusing on these areas is optional just because that automation and data has replaced all these routine tasks. And I can see, I think that's the foundation of start thinking of a business value, positive business value, and not just counter negative, right? Oh, you don't have this certification, fine, we'll do it. But what's next? So this what's next can be done just with data, for sure.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, going just the last point is really being able to manage budgets and being officially putting your resources. Like there's, some people don't realize outside of compliance the effort it takes to do an audit, or to go in and analyze what if there's any problems in certain areas. When now if we unlock compliance data, we can do it by just bringing that system data in, and then it just takes a few minutes for someone to go and analyze that data and kind of have a good understanding of where we stand. So that value right there is really key, and that's something that we're really driving when we talk about like all of our automation efforts. We're looking at it as like, what's the return on investment? If we're going to go and get this system data in, we're going to create these automations and be able to collect this evidence and analyze it. We need to make sure that we're doing it not just to do it, but doing it because it's actually can provide value to the business. It's going to provide value to not just compliance, but it can provide value to the stakeholders that have to go and potentially gather this evidence for us, that have the system access right now, that we'd have to go, nudge, tap on the shoulder and say, hey, we need this information. But like, as we mentioned previously, now we have that at our fingertips from a compliance perspective. And now we've saved that team time because we don't have to go and ask them to go and gather that. So there's so much value, not just in compliance that in terms of cost savings, but other organizations as well.
It's funny you mentioned how audit is hard, and one of the interesting thing I heard is the lack of standard, what it causes to the discussions with the auditors. So the auditors come and they want to get some assurance that things really happen, and they ask for something. Now, large organizations, everyone develops their own processes, their own way of implementation, even of different standard processes, but it looks different. And as long as there is no standard of data, there is a whole discussion around, okay, how can you show me this and that? And then the compliance managers show something, but the auditors are aiming for something else. And this lack of data standard causes a lot of friction and time-consuming discussions and ping pong with auditors. And it's even not just the evidence collection, but afterwards, the acceptance of some standard, just that saves so much time without these ping pongs afterwards. And if there is a clear way of displaying configurations, displaying processes, it saves and it creates a lot of clarity. So this mutual language is both internal in the company, as we said, like common controls framework, it's for the company, but it's also external with auditors, because PCI auditors are not necessarily your ISO auditors and are not necessarily the accountants for SOX or SOC 2 auditors. So different people, different approaches. You must have some data standard, and it eases the entire process.
This is great. I just wanted to give Omer one more chance to jump in here before we move over to customer questions. If there's anything that you wanted to chime in with about how, you know, business value is being driven through the effective use of security compliance data.
No, just the before and after was very clear. I remember before we went down this route, we were hiring for GRC like crazy, and we just couldn't keep up. We were trying to throw bodies at the problem, and it was clear that that was not going to scale. And when we switched to a more data-centric approach and established that partnership between the data organization and the compliance team, the whole approach changed. And the team stopped just throwing bodies at the problem, but the compliance analysts that were on the team felt so empowered, and it was cool to see the transformation. I think the whole job changed, and all of a sudden, from being a compliance person that mainly chases after people and different IT and DevOps to, hey, please show me this, send me the screenshot. It's more, hey, I can be creative and I can apply real skills to solve real problems. And it was just amazing to see that transformation, even on a human level.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you all so much. We're going to move over to some of the questions that we got from the audience. But before I do, I just want to say that if we don't get to all of them, we will do our best to provide answers as a follow-up. So don't worry. Our first question is, are there any specific tools or technologies that you recommend for leveraging and operationalizing security compliance data effectively? Omer, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think you want to think about this challenge across the stages of the data lifecycle. And so first you need to collect the data. And that's something that used to be pretty hard. It used to be kind of a science project where you needed to build all these connectors from scratch. Thankfully, that's changed. I think you have solutions now like Anecdotes that have gone through the hard work of implementing these different connectors that bring in the data. So that's great. Then you need to figure out, where's this data going to live? And my advice would be, don't leave this data in the tool that gathered it, because it's going to be so valuable to multiple use cases, and you get so much more value from it by having it in that kind of central data platform in this architecture that we refer to as a security data lake. So that's where, if you're at a company that uses Snowflake, bring the data into Snowflake. If you're a company that has some other solution as the central data platform, bring it in there, but just centralize it in a kind of general purpose data platform alongside all the other data sets. You got to have something that automatically applies that kind of validation logic to the data. And finally, think about how you're going to reflect the findings and the insights. Again, don't leave them siloed in kind of just a one tool. Make sure that you have a strategy for reflecting the insights to stakeholders across the board, your peers in IT, cloud engineering, the SecOps team, up to leadership, and potentially even out to partners, vendors, and customers. So really be thinking about that whole life cycle end to end.
Great. We'll take one more question from the audience. How do you approach communicating the value of compliance data to other stakeholders within the organization? Brian, I'll kick this over to you.
Yeah, you know, compliance data is so, it's like we mentioned previously, there's so much more to it than just for the use of compliance. It's how do we, you know, whenever I get or I'm asking for certain data or want to get certain data, I'm thinking about not just my team. I'm thinking like from the compliance operations perspective. I'm thinking about our internal audit teams. Like how can we benefit them and give them the information they need? Our external auditors, obviously, any of our auditors, and then also the first line of defense. You know, the business itself. You know, alleviating their workload that is caused by either audits or, you know, configuration settings, you know, figuring out ways to like make it so their job is easier is such a key aspect to being able to get people on board to unlock all this data. Is you got to really sell it. You got to really go and tell them that this is going to make your life easier and actually do it too.
I can see like when control owners are getting invited to work on a control that is equipped with data and not with some weird screenshots that were taken last year as a reference, it changes the entire experience. Or risk owners, or these are people from the entire company. It's not just the GRC team. The GRC team orchestrates the entire operation, but many people are involved as stakeholders. And again, it creates the mutual language and it makes their life easier because they know the data is being collected, analyzed, and now they should just track it.
And they can trust that. That's great. I see we have a couple more questions, but unfortunately that is all the time that we have for today. I do want to thank Omer, Brian, and Rory for a fascinating discussion. You have all definitely given us a lot to think about, so thank you so much. I also want to thank everybody who called in today for joining us on the webinar, and I wish you all a great rest of your day. See you all next time.
Thank you. You guys, thank you, Kayla. Thanks all.